out there to our viewers and listeners, and thank you for joining our podcast today. I'm Inga Kennedy, your host, and this is the third of a series of 6 podcasts that we are recording to bring you information on the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan. You've probably, and we hope you have, listened and viewed our first 2 podcasts. Our first podcast dealt with an overview or gave an overview of the study process and why we're doing this study. And the second podcast focused on what we're hearing from our freight industry leaders and truck drivers and community partners. As a reminder, the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan is a 14-month study focused on freight operations and traffic in the Aerotropolis area. Today, we are going to focus on emerging technologies, trends, and best practices. This is going to be an exciting series, and we have a panel of experts with us today who will focus on those topics. As a reminder, the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan information can be found on the website aerocids.com. You can learn more about the study as well as listen to our podcast there. But let's take a moment and introduce our guests today as they will begin to tell us more about these emerging technologies. And you guys are going to learn a lot about how things get shipped to you, particularly when you order them online or even when you go out to a dealership or something to buy a car. Let's start with Mark Plotkin with us from the Georgia Department of Transportation. We have Kelli Kemp with Modern Mobility Partners, and Kelli is a member of the consulting team conducting this study. And then we have Matt Markham with the Georgia Center for Innovation for Logistics. We're excited about having you here today. And before we get into our discussion, I'm going to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourselves and give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Mark Plotkin for the Georgia Department of Transportation, and I work in the Traffic Operations Division. I am the Traffic Management Center Manager, primarily focusing around incident management, service patrol, 511, and a lot of the other services that we offer to the motorists, specifically around the interstate system in Georgia.
Okay, good. Kelli?
Yes, my name is Kelli Kemp with Modern Mobility Partners, and I am part of the consultant team. Modern Mobility Partners is a transportation planning consulting firm. I'm one of the owners, and I have a long background, more years than I care to admit, in transportation planning. That includes freight, but more recently on the emerging technologies. So I'm leading the best practices in new and emerging technologies for the consulting team.
Okay, thank you. And Matt?
Yes, Matt Markham. I'm the Director of the Center of Innovation for Logistics. We're with the Georgia Department of Economic Development. And our center works primarily with existing companies in the state, trying to help them solve challenges when it comes to logistics and the supply chain, connect them to resources within the state, whether it's state government resources, university resources, or other private sector resources. And really the bottom line is we're here to help Georgia companies succeed and grow, and especially those who have freight to move or are looking to expand their business and need to utilize our state's infrastructure assets to do that.
Okay, that's good. That's good. And that's a good starting point with you. And we'll start our first question with you because I'm sure you hear a lot and are inquired of a lot about shipping. And tell us a little bit about the significant increases in online shopping and increased demands by consumers. And what are you hearing from our freight industry leaders about that aspect of freight movement, which is growing?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, it's the word on everybody's lips is about e-commerce. It's about online delivery. And the interesting thing, though, is that still makes up only about 10% of all retail sales or online sales. And so it's a very important segment, but it's also a segment that has a lot of room for growth.
Okay.
And so with that growth comes challenges and opportunities. Amazon, their Prime Day this year, I think they shipped 195 million products. That's guaranteed one-day delivery.
Wow.
For the first time, they guaranteed one-day delivery on their products. And so when Amazon makes decisions like this, it affects all sorts of different companies. So Walmart is doing their own version of that and having their own one-day delivery. You're seeing it in grocery. You're seeing it in more retail. And so those cause challenges, especially at the distribution level and at the last mile level. So companies are needing to figure out more effective strategies to get products quickly and to customers where they are. I mean, the days of moving a product to a store and having the customer pick it up from the store are over. Now customers want their products not only on their doorstep. There's situations where they want to deliver to their car and they want to deliver to a lot. I mean, it's become, the customer is now driving the supply chain and driving those decisions. And so companies are having to be much more proactive in making those decisions, whether it's warehousing location, the size of their distribution centers. And all of those things are factoring into how they can make sure they're being more customer-centric.
Okay, that's good. Let's talk a little bit, Mark, about some of the promising advances in technology. As you described your background and you talked a little bit about what you do with the Georgia Department of Transportation, what are some innovations in technology that can improve freight movement in our region?
Sure, and I think what a lot of people tend to lean towards is the signal prioritization, a lot of vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure type technologies, and a lot of that has a lot of unknown to it, or a lot of upfront work that goes into it. And when we're talking about something as Metro Atlanta, as specifically the Aerotropolis area, and freight in general, a lot of the stuff that we need to realize from the Georgia Department of Transportation side is, what can we do now? What can we do today? Okay. And so there are a lot of other things outside of that we can do today to assist. We have certain programs that are being brought to us now that revolve around electronic logging devices. So now that they are mandated, there are the pros and the cons to that. One of the pros is it gives us the ability to push messaging to anybody that has this type of device, primarily tractor-trailer drivers. So if you're coming into an area that is consistently having congestion or is a truck rollover location, it gives us the ability to push them a message based on either their current speed or historic information that we have as a department to let them know you're coming up to an area that has congestion or you're coming up to an area that is notorious for truck rollover. Okay. And by doing those types of things, whether it doesn't necessarily sound like a flashy piece of technology, that allows us to either prevent an incident, prevent a secondary incident, protect the queue. So if you're sitting there and you're in traffic or you're exiting the interstate itself and you're in right lane congestion, the last thing you want to see is somebody coming from behind you at a higher speed. And this would allow us, through the electronic logging device, to alert them through that messaging, because sometimes there may be a grade change or there is a difference when you're driving a tractor trailer that you just don't notice what's going on ahead of you. And so it gives us that ability. There's another product that we have that we've been utilizing as a pilot that's actually become into full fruition for the department now, and it's called automated incident detection. And so kind of take that the way it is. When you think automated incident detection, you immediately kind of snap to and say, oh, that's for an accident or that's for a crash. And not necessarily, because it revolves around pedestrians, bikes, wrong way detection, debris in the roadway, and then the actual incident itself. And what that does is, rather than having to respond to an incident, the system itself can tell us something is going on. So if we have congestion that's outside of the norm, the system will tell us so that we know that this is an unsafe condition or this is not a usual condition. And it's the same thing. We can dispatch somebody to an incident to clear it up faster if we know exactly when it happens. We're not waiting for somebody to notify us of an event. So what we're doing on the front end is responding faster to any type of incident or debris and really clearing the roadway and allowing that throughput that we would like to have on a day-to-day basis.
Okay. That's good. That's a lot of promise. Is there anyone else who'd like to join in?
I just thought I'd elaborate on the freight signal priority because I think what Mark talked about is excellent and is kind of like an immediate thing, low-hanging fruit that we can do. And I would say maybe that next tier of low-hanging fruit could potentially be freight signal priority. And what we mean by that is allowing additional green time for trucks going through a signalized intersection. And that would typically be done off-peak hours that could be regulated by the folks that own the signal and coordinated with. So it might be really early in the morning when there's not as much traffic, but the warehousing and distribution centers are open to accept deliveries. And so that reduces the truck's travel time, which saves them money, and it also reduces their fuel consumption, which saves them money. So those are two big things for them. And it also incentivizes the trucks to travel during those off-peak hours, which would reduce congestion during the peak hours when people are going to and from work, keeping in mind that a truck driver's peak hours are different than a passenger vehicle's, the rest of us that are going to and from work. It's a little bit different time of day. So one thing that we're really excited about is that through the Aerotropolis Atlanta Community Improvement Districts, who sponsors this freight clusters plan study, as well as the Virginia Avenue Smart Corridor in coordination with the Atlanta Regional Commission, has partnered up with the Georgia Department of Transportation and the cities within the corridor near the airport that include Hateville, College Park, and East Point to upgrade the signals along that 2-mile corridor to include communication abilities between the signals as well as back to GDOT's Traffic Management Center, and allows them to kind of set the foundation for what could be transit signal priority or emergency vehicle preemption and potentially freight signal priority. Along that corridor specifically, we may not look at freight signal priority because there's not quite as many trucks. But along other corridors, we could. And as a result of that effort, the Aerotropolis Atlanta Community Improvement Districts, in partnership with GDOT, was able to get that first step installed along all the signals at GDOT's cost along the cities, within the entireties of the cities of East Point, Hateville, and College Park. So we can then go in and add in later freight signal priority as well as these other things. So that's very exciting. So we're setting the stage now. It's an early win for the CIDs, for the region, and for GDOT, and we're real excited about that.
That's good because all of you know that we hear from the public about signalization improving, or they call it synchronizing signalization. But within the Aerotropolis area, particularly Highway 29, is one of those corridors that we often hear from people about signalization and just general flow of traffic and improved traffic. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Because all of them have a piece of the Highway 29.
They do.
And so that's good to know, and the public will be pleased to hear that that information and that update on freight signalization. And so, Kelli, while you're talking, you recently attended a autonomous vehicle, I would say, and you'll tell us more about that, conference in Florida. And tell us more about what's coming regarding autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles and what that means to freight movement in our area.
Yeah, and so... Well, there's a lot coming, and there's a difference of opinion on when it's coming.
Okay.
That's one thing I can say.
Yeah, so they're at different scales.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, what I have heard that through our best practices review and through for this project as well as through the conference and others, that as it relates to trucking, what in the industry, what is referred to as level 4, which is high automation within a truck, they're expecting that within the next 5 years for trucks. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be driverless vehicles all over the place, but looking at highly automated trucks that will likely still have a safety driver in them are expected, and within around 5 years or so. But yeah, and there's truck platooning. And so that is when trucks can follow really closely to each other and communicate with each other using technology. And you might have maybe 3 of them or more. Well, you can actually couple 2, but 3 or more of them typically. And that's something that they're looking at, and that saves fuel consumption. Again, that's like a major cost for truckers in the trucking industry, so that's something they try to do. So there's already been pilots across the country, whether it's in Colorado or other places where they've been looking at that. And even the United States Postal Service, USPS, did a pilot recently out west that looked at driverless postal trucks.
Okay.
I believe it was out near Phoenix, and looking at a 2-week pilot on what that would do. And once that progresses, there's going to be significant impacts on our transportation system. And so just looking at, what can we do now to kind of look through that crystal ball to try to plan as best we can.
Okay. All right. And Matt, Mark, do you all have?
Yeah, I mean, and we talk to people in the industry, some who are working on this technology,
Right.
and some who would be consumers of the technology. And I think Kelly's right. There's some difference of opinion on how quickly you would see any sort of larger scale adoption. The technology is coming along. There is still there's still a lot that needs to get done before it's really feel like it can be at scale.
Okay.
Where we are seeing some of it and where we're likely to see it deployed earlier are in those controlled environments.
Okay.
So on a warehouse facility
Right.
itself, and the
Right.
footprint where they can control more of the additional transportation that's moving through and those sorts
Right.
of things. And so those are things that are there to address problems. I think the bigger thing, and it kind of touches on what Mark was saying earlier too, is the biggest breakthrough overall is the amount of data that we can now collect about freight.
Okay.
And the ability in freight and traffic and all of those different things, and the ability to collect it, the ability to interpret it, and then to make actionable decisions, or to create a software or a piece of technology that can use that data to make better decisions, to operate more efficiently. I mean, even though there have been a lot of moves on that, we're really at the early stage when it comes to logistics and supply chain of seeing that really big explosion of using data to transform the industry. There's a lot of processes and things that are still going on in a paper-based way and in a traditional way that's ripe for that kind of disruption that really sees the big needle movers on those technological shifts. Autonomous vehicles definitely being one of them, but all of the different sensor devices that you can either put on a roadway, that you can put into a container, or put on a truck, that allows these streams of data that can then be used to make decisions and to make to optimize. Whether it's how you do your distribution, how you move your freight, those kinds of things. And there's really exciting things going on there that are going to be big.
That's good. That's good. Mark?
Yeah, and to add on to that, I mean, data is the big missing piece. And it's when we talk about it, especially around the office or at seminars and conferences, it's like standing in front of a fire hose.
Right.
And there's
right.
so much data that's being thrown at us, especially when it comes to autonomous vehicles
Yes.
and freight, that it's really hard to take everything and kind of connect the dots. And I think we're starting to connect the dots, but we're never going to catch up to what's happening in the private sector or in the freight industry, because there's money directly tied to that.
Right.
And so you will start seeing the trends specifically around tractor trailers.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start seeing those trends, those are the things that are really coming to fluidity. And those are things that we need to pay attention to.
Okay, good. And that's a good segue into the next question. And I'd like for all of you to participate, because all of you are touching on what's happening in other cities. So let's talk about some of the other cities and what some cities are doing that we can learn from freight movement and how to improve freight. You've all touched on cities that are doing innovative things. And so, Mark, I'll start with you.
Sure. Not really going to touch onto a city, but more
Okay.
of a coalition.
Okay.
We do a lot of work with the I-95 Corridor Coalition.
Okay.
And for anybody that doesn't know what I-95 Corridor Coalition is, basically 95 runs through the entire East Coast from
Yep.
Maine to Florida. And the coalition gets everybody together that has any mileage of 95 that covers their state, and really gets you together as a group to understand the trends of freight, and not just tractor trailers. They're talking air, train, ship, everything, kind of in one conference or one conversation, whether it be travel, the transport of goods, or incidents themselves, how to deal with inclement weather. And what this coalition does is kind of spreads the word of what the sister states and sister agencies are
Okay.
doing,
All right.
whether it be an MPO or a local agency,
Right.
and brings everybody together so that we're making sure that whatever effort you have going on is an effort that others can utilize. So I think when we start talking about trucking and truck parking and truck staging, I-95 Corridor Coalition's really kind of leading that from the transportation side, because they have the ability to push pilots in different states, but really gather that information and give it to us. And so unfortunately with truck parking and truck staging, the things that are real hot topics right now, there's no proven data to it. But I-95 Corridor Coalition is really leading that way and making sure that whatever is going on, the results that we're seeing are being brought to all the stakeholders in it. So like I said, it originally was the entire East Coast with 95. Now they're to the point where it's most of the states won over as well. So I think Alabama just recently joined. So it's becoming this larger coalition that spreads beyond I-95 itself and allows us to really have this common platform to understand what's going on, especially revolving around freight.
That's good. That's good. That's the first I'm hearing of the I-95 coalition, and but that certainly makes sense as it moves through lots of different states and cities. Kelli?
Yeah, I think, just to kind of tag on to Matt, what you had mentioned earlier about 10% of goods and movement is from e-commerce, but there's a lot of growth opportunities there. I think that's going to impact the locations of and densities of the freight warehousing and distribution centers that will impact our transportation network. And we even talked about this at the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan Freight Forum last week, where we got great feedback from our attendees that talked about how we need to be looking at the trend, and Brooklyn's been doing this with vertical warehousing design, among others. I mean, I rode around with Mayor Bodie with the city of Palmetto recently, and he showed me just right down the road, he showed me where they have 2-story warehousing spec buildings that they've built several of them, but they can even go beyond that. My point being, Brooklyn and other areas have been looking at the vertical warehousing design, and what we were hearing, and I agree with the folks from the Freight Forum last week, was that the land was it gets cheaper and cheaper the further out you go from the cities, but with e-commerce and that instant delivery, same-day delivery, you can only move out so far to make that happen. And so folks are going to start looking closer back into areas like the Aerotropolis area and looking at relocating or locating warehousing and distribution centers here, but at a higher density. And so it may be redeveloping some of our 1-story ones. So how does that impact the travel patterns, and how can we plan for that as part of the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan? So that's something that's trending, and we need to keep our eye on.
Okay, that's good. That's good. Matt?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because warehousing, at the same time as the warehousing footprints are getting larger, and they're also getting smaller. Right. So it's on the one end, you're seeing a lot more of distribution centers of over 1 million square feet designed to be on a suburban area to feed the population centers. But at the same time, as Kelli, as you point out, as land, you run out of land opportunities, those costs go up to build 1 million square foot facilities. So in Brooklyn, and we've looked at some of it potentially in Atlanta, and some places have seen about trying to do smaller, vertical warehouse, reusing old buildings in the interior of a city to be able to make those needs, because that's where a lot of the technology is going to try and meet that last mile, that piece that gets you from a distribution center to a doorstep. I work for the Department of Economic Development, so I'm not allowed to talk about other cities or states doing good things, right? We have to only talk about Georgia. There are other cities that are doing interesting things, but I do think that it's important to note just how much is going on in the city of Atlanta, anchored at Georgia Tech, especially with these technology investments and these startups that are working to solve some of these problems, to be able to use the data, the new ability to make it actionable. As you said, there's so much there, but you've got to have something that you can work with. And there's a big startup culture around supply chain technology in Atlanta that is working on some of these last mile problems and working on some of these abilities to change the business model for distribution so people can meet those needs.
That's good. That's good. Anything else?
I would just add one more thing as it relates to curbside management.
Okay.
With delivery trucks of all sizes, as well as your transportation network companies like your Ubers and Lyfts. The Seattle area has been doing some pilots on occupancy sensors along the curb that they use to figure out when vehicles are there and the type, and then they predict trends and actually start figuring out, okay, when would be the best time for trucks to deliver, and can we communicate that to them via technology?
Okay.
So that's something interesting. We did look at that as part of our best practices review. It's a little more expensive.
Yeah.
So that might be further out, but that is something else that's going on.
Okay, that's good. That's interesting. Curbside management, because we all have gotten in lanes behind delivery trucks and have gotten stuck or can't get around, or just traffic backup.
Yeah, and with the the further proliferation of the whether it's Uber or Lyft, but now DoorDash and what are the different Uber Eats.
That's right.
Every vehicle is a potential freight vehicle now,
That's right.
and so this idea of curbside management is how do you understand the flow of not just your UPS truck or your FedEx truck, but now it's going to be the the Toyota that's bringing food to people at their front door.
Very good point.
Roadie, the people that are using individual vehicles to ship products around it.
That's
so
right.
it makes the planner's job even harder to
That's
try and
right.
keep up with those different trends.
That's right. Good.
Yeah, I was. My son's tutor, turns out she's also an Amazon Flex driver on the weekends, and so it's anybody's just
That's
driving
right.
freight and goods around
Right.
all over the place now.
And as Matt said, we have to plan for it.
Yeah.
So then, speaking of planning, Kelly, let's talk a little bit about how we can use all of these technologies for the freight cluster plan. And how can we use some of it to make improvements in our area? And everybody join in, because you know the area and know what could work. Of course, we have the intersection, the I-285 and Camp Creek intersection improvement there that's going on, that's going to significantly help. But tell us a little bit about what other technologies that we've discussed today might work.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we're doing, and it's through the Aerotropolis Freight Cluster Plan, as well as kind of piggybacking off of opportunities through the Southern Fulton Comprehensive Transportation Plan as well. But we're kind of doing a proactive smart corridor analysis where we're identifying good candidate corridors that would be good for smart freight corridors, whether it's freight signal priority or some of these other technologies that we brought up today. And so looking at what equipment is out there now and what are some low-hanging fruit, looking at the truck volumes and high crash locations and stuff like that. So I think that in looking at the information and knowing the area like we do, I think a good low-hanging fruit candidate right out the gate might be Camp Creek Parkway. Extending west of the interstates and not just, the Divergent Diamond interchange that's being constructed, but looking at some smart technologies along there, whether it's freight signal priority or otherwise. There's already communications along Camp Creek Parkway. Communications meaning the telecommunications, the ability for the signals to talk with each other and back to the Transportation Management Center. So, So I think the freight signal priority is the first thing that we want to look at. And then some of these other things that Mark mentioned as well that GDOT's been looking at, I think might be some potential as well. They also might be part of a broader conversation that's not just to a corridor specific. It's a little more regional in nature. And so I think that's a larger conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And as we talk to our freight industry leaders, and some of the information that came out of the intercept surveys, they are looking at it, or they would like for it to be viewed from a regional perspective in terms of innovation. What else is out there that might work within the Aerotropolis footprint?
It's more along the lines of tying what we're talking about together, talking about freight signal prioritization, but we're also talking about truck platooning and truck staging. Well, if you have the ability to stage in an area where you have your warehouses and you have the ability to know when somebody is platooning out of these, and we have the ability for freight signal prioritization itself, you incentivize the platooning. Rather than having individuals staggering out, you let them all leave in one platoon itself. So you're basically purging the system all at once. And so if you understand when that platooning is happening and giving that prioritization based off of it, it really allows more throughput through. And it's really something that is simple. It's something that ties on what we're already talking about. and it also incentivizes from the private side for this to actually be done.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I just reiterate, like we talked about this last week at the Freight Forum as well. We had great discussion.
We did.
And one of the things that we talked about is in the areas that we're going to look at freight signal priority, for instance, we need to also look at staging areas, because what happens if the truck gets there early and then has to wait?
That's right.
Where do they
That's
go?
right. That's right.
And we know there's a shortage of truck parking throughout the region. So that's something that, so it all ties together. It's a collective solution.
Mm-hmm. Matt?
Yeah, and I
anything
think
around-
that, I've talked with different groups that have done different studies throughout the state or have looked at these sorts of things, and really what this idea of making sure you're bringing together all those different voices, because when it comes to policy making, infrastructure development is one thing. You can identify the roads, the intersections where you need them. When it comes to developing, whether it's signal prioritization or different times for trucks to be going through certain corridors, just making sure that that matches the reality of what the industry is doing, and the surveys and the things that you're doing, you're capturing those things. But it sounds so simple, but you'd be surprised. I was talking to someone who worked for UPS, and they were talking about something out in, I think it was San Francisco, or it may have been in Seattle, or a city council that was just saying, well, here's what we're going to do is we're just going to say you just need to make all of your deliveries between midnight and 6 a.m. and the UPS folks said, absolutely, we'll be happy to do that as long as you can guarantee that the businesses will be open to receive their deliveries then.
Right,
That's right.
Because
That's
that doesn't match up with the reality of what
Right.
they have to do. The businesses want to get their packages when they're there. They're not going to leave packages that are sitting outside. Distribution centers have certain hours of operation. They're not all 24/7 businesses that are able to manage. And so understanding that a policy decision has to match the reality of what the
That's a good
industry is
point.
doing is
Yeah.
critical.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
a very
that's where
good
all
point.
the surveys
Absolutely.
and the things are doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good point. Any other wrap-ups as we're finalizing this discussion on emerging technologies? I can't wait for the public to hear some of this because it's where things are going in terms of freight movement and how it affects the community and how we receive things and ship things. And so we're excited about the public hearing this podcast. And if there are no other comments or issues to Mark, Kelli, and Matt, thank you so much for joining us today for
Thank
our
you.
third podcast. This was really, really good discussion about emerging technologies, and man, have we come a long way. But as you say, we have a long way to go too, and so, but at least we're on track. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us today. Remember to visit the Aerotropolis Atlanta CID's website at aerocids.com. Learn more about them, and then you can drill down to the Freight Cluster Plan. Just click on Freight Cluster Plans from their website and learn more about what we are doing here in the Aerotropolis area to manage freight activity, and also to give us your feedback on what you are experiencing and what you'd like to see happen. And so until then, until our next podcast, thank you so much. Our next podcast, by the way, will begin talking about recommendations and some of the existing conditions of things that we're seeing and moving forward with how we're going to use some of this innovation in the future. So we'll see you then. Thank you.